This episode is sponsored by Bark Technologies. I am so grateful that these days parents have a safer device option for our children. The Bark phone was built for families who are looking to ramp up their child's online safety. It has parental controls built into it, unlike the iPhone, and helps us manage their entire digital experience super easily. Let's get into the episode. Today, hey Chris, I have Chris McKenna, the founder of Protect Young Eyes. How are you today?
Good. Great to be here to talk about something pretty interesting for both of us, I think, with kiddos in the middle of all of it, right?
Oh, yeah. So I noticed you've been mentioning screens in school, particularly, everyone's talking about phone bans and smartphones in school, but I want to get us back to thinking about the school issued devices, the iPads and the Chromebooks. I want to start here because I know that you are in a lot of schools. You spend a lot of time speaking to teachers and students. And, while I think the schools that bring you on are being a little bit more proactive in their protections and education around screens, I wonder if you have a vibe around what's the current state of school issued devices in schools. Are most one-to-one? Are we seeing computer carts? Are we seeing delay of school issued devices? So what are you seeing in your travels?
So I'm not seeing a delay in school issued devices, and all the different permutations of that you just described, whether it's a cart or in the case of my kids, for example, they each have a Chromebook that has been assigned to them that can come home. And it was the same for my daughter when she was in high school. So for context for watchers or listeners of this, I have a 7th, 8th, and 9th grader currently, right? And then my daughter is now in college, but I remember vividly what she had and wanting to understand it. We go to a public school. We do a lot of presentations at public, private, kind of all the different types of schools. And it doesn't matter. Like that really, in my observation, hasn't had much of an impact on my observations related to technology. I would say overall, there are probably more faith-based schools who have taken a more aggressive approach when it comes to not introducing technology into some of the younger grades. If there are any schools that I've seen make any decisions around that, they're almost always faith-based, but there still aren't that many of them. So I did speak right at a school out west, a couple, let's say it would have been at the end of a school year, and they made the decision as a school that there was no technology needed in grades K through 5.
Wow.
Right. And I applauded that, and I've praised them for that. And I've shared that with other schools. Then they have a slow approach. I've gone through their curriculum for how they introduce technology in grades 6, 7, and 8, and then get into a lot of digital wellness, more specific topics in high school. But that is a rare thing. What I just described there, compared to all kinds of schools who all the way down to kindergarten have introduced iPads. It's most often iPads that I feel like have been introduced at the younger grades. They're easier for kids to navigate because a lot of kids come in with more of a tablet approach to technology. That's maybe what they've been given as young children from their parents. So it's very natural for a kindergartner to just pick up an iPad and know exactly what to do. Chances are they've been doing that at home, and that's a comfortable digital environment for them to navigate. So I definitely see a lot more of that than I do the story that I described in the K through 5 situation. So,
do you mind sharing what that school name is, just in case parents live nearby there and want to look it up?
It's American Heritage Academies in Utah. They have a number of campuses. They have, virtual school, but they've taken a very aggressive approach in when and how technology is introduced into their curriculum.
Okay. And share, if you have insight on this, why did they make that decision? And that kind of goes along with, do you believe that kids learn better from screens, or is it more harmful than beneficial at those younger ages?
Well, I can't speak specifically as to why they made that decision. It was made before I got there. But if they're a school, then I'm hoping that they made the decision based on educational research. Which would be, and I know that sounds kind of snarky to say, but I would hope that that's the reason that curriculum-based, learning-based decisions are being made across all the different decisions that are made at a school. Like, shouldn't it be made on research? Shouldn't it be made on measured educational outcomes?
Right.
And whether or not the outcomes that are achieved in digital are better, not only better in learning, but better for the child. If you can't answer those two basic questions about the technology that's being introduced, then why are we introducing it? And I think that's what's missing across the board, is we're not asking very basic questions about technology, like we did with, say, a math curriculum or a reading or a phonics curriculum or all the other things that we've introduced into education, I'm guessing we ask some pretty basic questions around what are the outcomes? How are the students interacting with it? Right? Just basic things. We are not asking those questions related to technology. And that's the problem. So I don't know exactly why they made the decision that they did. My observation is that there are way too many schools that aren't making decisions based on the criteria I think they should be using.
Well, why do you think we made that decision? And let's go back before COVID, like early 2010s, we really started dumping like hardware dump onto schools without any research that kids learn better from those devices. So what is your opinion? Why do you think that happened?
Well, I can speculate, in a couple of ways. The businesses that are behind these technologies are very good at peddling these technologies. And let's be honest, so I don't want to throw out everything here in the bathwater. For some schools that from a resource perspective can't buy textbooks every year or have certain limitations around the physical resources that they can be replacing or getting, there is some utility. But I want to having, say, a digital version of something that is evergreen, that's always being updated, that you don't have to replace with a new version every other year kind of stuff. Totally understand that. But what has to be considered is what I said before. What are the outcomes from doing that? What are the impacts from doing that? And are the children benefiting as much as we are in our budget from this choice that we've made? Yes, it saves money. And yes, we now have version 10, instead of version 2 of whatever history book. But if our children aren't learning anything from it, or if we're putting them in a digital space that is just like the digital space where they play Roblox at home, what are the chances they're going to be able to focus during the 45 minutes that they're in class versus the 4 to 5 hours they're on that same iPad or a different iPad at home? We've asked our kids to try to focus and to do things that is simply unfair to them, that none of us would have been able to do at that age either. I mean, imagine if history class, I'll talk to Gen X for just a minute. Imagine if you were asked to study history on your Nintendo while Mario was on the side. Right. Like that's kind of what we've done, right? When you think about the type of digital environment that we've put them in, Chromebooks are the same place where I watch YouTube videos at home that are crazy and full of memes. And I also try to learn. iPads are where I play games and FaceTime with grandma and do all these silly things. Yet it's also where I'm asked to do my assignments. Like that's a mixed space that our children do not have biliterate brains. They have brains that are very concrete and focused in certain areas, sort of one thing at a time. And we're asking them to do unreasonable things.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things going on here. And I have dozens of links to research articles that show that when it comes to learning from paper versus a digital screen, kids learn better from paper or analog. And so I won't go through all of that here, but the research exists to prove that. And there's not research to prove that kids learn better from devices over paper. In fact, research is showing that the device learning is detrimental because of the distractions, also the ineffectiveness of the educational apps. What is your opinion on the actual educational apps that are being presented to our children? For example, I was talking to a mom at school yesterday. She has a kindergartner. The kindergartner literally came up to us and said, "Mommy, I was playing with this racing game during class." And she goes, "Oh, he's talking about his iPad." And she goes, "Racing cars." She's like, "Was there letters or numbers?" And he said, "Nope, just cars. And I got a trophy." And he was really excited about that. And we're thinking, how in any way is that educational to that kindergartner? And that is what I'm seeing across a lot of these ed tech apps is a lot of gamification, rewards, and not a lot of learning. So what is your opinion on the quality of the apps that are being given to our children?
So in December of 2022, Nikki, a report from Internet Safety Labs found that 96% of the apps that schools required or recommended aren't safe primarily because they share information with third parties
Right.
or contain ads. 96%, which means that when children go to other spaces, they're targeted based on things that we're doing during learning. So what this points to, so there's a lot that we could talk about there. Privacy is a massive concern.
Yeah.
Most ed tech violates FERPA, the student privacy rules, and are not evaluated by schools before they're introduced into education. They're also not always introduced with learning outcomes in mind. And so these are just things that we need to remember, right? That idea that a child understands the difference between learning or not. Again, they don't have a brain that is able to separate. And so when we put them inside of those gamified places, they're not focused. They clearly aren't. And so when it comes to the decisions that are being made, those are the sorts of problems that are just an example of what kids are running into. I mean, that example you just gave, it just makes you go, wait a minute, why? Why would you introduce that into learning when it's really not helping the child learn?
Right. It's keeping them quiet and distracted, but is that what we want them to be experiencing at school? And privacy thing that you mentioned is really interesting. I asked our district, I got a list of what apps my kids get access to during school this year. I sent the list to the tech guy at the district and asked what data is being shared on my children from these specific apps. It took several weeks to hear back, and it was a pretty lengthy list of information, including their name and their location and their gender and their race and all of this information that, come to find out, I'm the first person to have ever asked this question. And I made a request, can we proactively know this information? I think that parents, I believe schools are allowed to legally opt children in on our behalf for sharing that information during school. But I think parents should be aware of that. So just something like for parents, ask that question, because that's a lot of personal information, right?
It is. And schools must, according to FERPA, which is a federal student privacy law here in the United States, for those that are listening to the US, schools must have written permission from the parent or eligible student, if they say are emancipated or whatever it might be, to release any information from a student's education record. So where they are, what they're learning, what they're doing, right? All of that personal information, it belongs to the student, not to the school, and certainly not to the apps that they're using. And so, And that's what's shocking is parents don't even, I think, and this isn't shaming or calling anybody out, we don't sometimes even know what questions to ask.
Sure.
Because for a long time, there was no risk. You had a history book. Like, what was the risk that somebody was going to violate me as a fifth grader in any way of privacy or information from the history book that I was reading, right? So these questions are new. And the problem is we used to just trust that schools were making these decisions about education, again, answering the basic questions. Is it achieving educational outcomes? Is it harmful for our children? They're not asking those questions. Therefore, they're running to technologies that they have not vetted because there's $1 billion marketing machine run by the largest companies on earth that is feeding schools what they think they need. And I'll just call out a bit of what can sometimes be schools not wanting to be behind. There's a competitive landscape out there for schools who are competing with other schools, especially private schools. And you don't want to be the only one who doesn't have iPads in elementary school if all the other schools do, maybe. And I know that is a real pressure that some school leaders feel. I'm not excusing it. I don't think it's a valid reason to make decisions, but I have got to believe that is part of what is also going on here.
Yeah. And there's no better way to create lifelong customers than to force the kids to use this product line from when they're 5 years old in kindergarten. I mean, there's that. And then there's also, we were promised by big tech that our kids would be digital super learners and they're digital natives and they're going to be the next big tech executive. And let's talk about, do you have insight into how that's going? Like, are these promises being met? Are our children doing better than ever regarding their educational outcomes?
So as I tell parents, children not having access to technology, particularly during the elementary school years, is in no way going to force them to go to a worse college. It's in no way going to make them get a worse job someday. In fact, if I could go just purely science for just a minute, the chief science officer from the American Psychological Association, Dr. Mitch Prinstein, a guy who I've spent time with, doing talks with. He gave me this quote, and I shared it on social media. He said, there are no findings showing harm to children who stay off of social media. In fact, some emerging evidence suggests that the most socially competent kids are refraining from using these platforms.
Yeah.
In other words, those kids who are most equipped, those kids who maybe are the most resilient, those kids who understand how to interact face to face with other humans and deal in a world that sometimes has difficult humans, are those who are actually refraining from you and I both know Jonathan Haidt calling the screen-based childhood.
Yeah.
And it's not going well, right? That's probably, the four things that Jonathan Haidt talks about in The Anxious Generation, right? Get phones out of schools, wait for social till 16. The one that is getting the least amount of press, but deserves more, like 10 times more press than it's getting, is the play-based childhood.
Right.
To get kids back to stubbing their toes and skinning their knees and figuring things out on their own and falling off of playground equipment and all of those things that we have bubble wrapped them from with promises from a digital world that have never fulfilled, the promises that they made. So,
yeah. And one important thing about that, I think, is independent play that he talks about, John Haidt in his book. And
that's right.
Risky I hear a lot almost. And I hear a lot of parents, though, that'll be like, okay, I'm going to let them go down to the park on their own, but I'm going to put a watch on them so that I can be there for them if anything happens. What do you feel about that deep need for parents these days to just be in constant contact with our children? Is it better for us to just let them go and make sure they know what to do if something happens, talk to an adult, find your way back home? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I'm okay. I'm not binary on that, where either you let them go with nothing, or you've made the bad, non-play based decision. We do live in a world where some of the ways to get in touch, like I can't just stop by a gas station and ask for a phone book to call somebody. I'm going very 1980s here for a minute.
Yeah.
Right? The world now just expects that every human has his or her own individual way to communicate. That's just kind of generally the way it is. So I'm okay with a talk, text, GPS sort of thing. But as a parent, say a watch or something that maybe can see where the kid is going, I would love that decision with a child who is out and about playing and having a good time any day over one that isn't, due to fear and in other ways. And there's a bit of an agreement that I want parents to have there, right? It's the same sort of conversation I have with parents of older kids when it comes to like Life 360 or things like that, right? Right? It's okay. It's sort of the premise of use, don't abuse, right? Like use it for and have this sort of agreed upon posture with what is going to be used. Like with your teen, you sit down, you describe, how it's going to be used. You as a parent promise how you're not going to use it, and abide by those things. It's not a device or an app that's being used in order to catch a child doing something wrong. It's actually something that you have in place when something is wrong so that you can respond. And I think that's it's a simple mindset shift, that it's not a got you, right? That watch isn't I'm trying to catch you being somewhere where you're not. It's if you happen to be somewhere where you didn't expect, I'll come and help you out. But until then, have fun, dude. Like that's the mindset that I want us to have with those kinds of technologies that are available today.
Yeah, and just like school issued devices, the watches now are often having a lot of distractions to make it more of a toy than a tool. Like they have the front facing cameras and they'll have little games. And I wouldn't be surprised if they start rolling out a little TikTok feed or something on there at some point. So it's just, crossing the line a little when it comes to the functionality and allowing your kid to become distracted from the play by using the toy on their wrist. So thank you for your input on the watches. And I think definitely all parents get Anxious Generation book by Jonathan Haidt. But back to school issue devices and the conversation about like, how is it going? Are our kids doing so great now that they're learning from devices? And there's international studies on test scores that show huge drops across the board in reading, mathematics, science. So what are you hearing around those test score drops and how our kids are doing after being inundated with device learning for about a decade?
Yeah, this was one of the conversations that I was a part of with Dr. Prinstein over in Europe earlier this year, where we had full panels of experts, people far superior to myself, having conversations at that kind of global level, at the sort of WHO kind of, UNESCO kind of level. And it's fairly universal. And I'm guessing that some of what you might share with the notes to this conversation is what PISA puts out, which they do every couple of years. Now, there's some controversy. Not everybody buys into fully what the Program for International Student Assessment is doing. So maybe you don't take it verbatim, but look at it for signals. I think there's some signals that, even if you don't agree fully with what it is or what it represents, there are some signals that I think we should pay attention to. It's a fairly diverse sample, right? Almost 700,000 students from 81 countries. And we did see drops across the board. And for the first time in 2022, which was released in 2023, they asked students about technology distractions while they were learning. And that's what was fascinating, right? That 65% of students said they got distracted while using what were supposedly school devices for learning. And even if they didn't have a device of their own, let's say they were using paper and pen, 59% reported being distracted just simply at the desk in proximity to another student who was using a digital device.
Like a secondhand smoke effect.
Exactly. So screen time. We talk about that with parents. The parents using screens in front of kids and not talking to them is kind of like the new parental secondhand smoke.
Right. Totally.
And that's particularly true, I think, in a learning environment, which is why you're not away for the day if the policy for personal devices is in the backpack. Because it's still distracting me. It might not even be enough to put it in the locker because kids still sneak them, right? That's why we say yonder pouches, and actually preventing access to it is the only thing that really causes that amazing, curious, but highly distractible teen brain from not being pulled away from the focus of the things they're trying to learn. So they're really interesting data that I think, again, you don't have to agree with everything that a study says, but I want to step back and just look at some of the signals that it should point us toward. And there is a signal that is clearly pointing toward distraction. There is a signal that is clearly pointing toward less equals better outcomes. One of the more critical things that PISA pointed to was that students who spend less than 1 hour, Nikki, 1 hour of leisure time on digital devices at school scored almost 50 points higher in math, which in that scale was almost like a year and a half of learning.
Wow. So,
and this isn't a bad kid issue. This isn't a bad school issue. It's bad technology that wasn't designed with learning outcomes in mind. So until we can come up with that device, which is designed with that in mind, in the same way that we've designed social media without kids' brains in mind, right? We can't expect kids to learn when we've put them in things that aren't intended to cause them to learn. That's an expected outcome. So those are some of the signals that I get from those kinds of global studies that I think we should step back and really pay attention to.
Right. Okay. And why can't we lock down these school issued devices in a way where they cannot access any of the distractions? Teachers that I talk to say that if they assign something on the device, okay, work on this for 20 minutes. Some teachers say a 50% chance they'll be working on schoolwork versus something else. Or some teachers go, there's a 0% chance they're doing what they're supposed to be doing unless I am literally walking around behind them. And that's often, schools will give teachers software so they can mirror all the screen, like solving a tech problem with more tech, like instead of just more face-to-face learning. But these devices, they have so many distractions. The kids can get access to social media, to games, to Netflix, NFL.com, watch football games. They're communicating with predators on there through Discord. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are happening that shouldn't be happening. So what is your thoughts around why can't we lock them down?
That is a great question for Google.
I know.
That is a great question for Apple.
Yeah.
They're the ones who have manufactured these devices, and they have the ability to do exactly what you're doing, what you just described.
Right.
They can solve all these problems. They have the technology to solve every single one of these problems. But why would they? they're selling these devices like hotcakes. Everybody's buying them. I mean, why? There's no incentive. They're not being measured. Like they're not being measured on the test scores of the kids who end up with these devices in the classroom. They're,
Right.
Bottom line is impacted in no way at all. There's sort of there's a dual responsibility here. They need to be doing more. We talk about this, often at Protect Young Eyes, that there are layers in society that are wrapped around our kiddos and all have a responsibility to protect them. And none of the layers are really doing their job. We typically talk about 5: companies, policymakers, schools, faith organizations, and parents. And all of them have a responsibility to protect children from harm. And none of them are doing an adequate job consistently and persistently right now in that, what I believe, shared duty of care to protect our children.
Sure.
And so schools need to be making different decisions. Policymakers need to hold companies accountable for not making decisions that line up. And companies need to make better decisions around these sorts of devices, actually make a device. I mean, how can you tell me that it's not possible to make a Chromebook that lets a kid just use Google Docs and not share it with other kids to get into trouble, or doesn't let a kid also get to YouTube? Or these are the simplest things to solve. My Apple Watch can tell me how many times I rolled over last night. There are simple things that we're asking them to do, and yet we're not seeing them make very simple, logical decisions because there's no incentive to do so.
Right. And the funding for the school districts on being able to implement safeguards. Like I requested, why does, kinder through 3rd, 4th grade need YouTube, adult YouTube, accessible on their iPads? Maybe the older grades do, and you can trust them a little more, probably not, but to use it in an educational way. But I was told that they don't have the ability to remove it from some of the iPads, but not all of the iPads for the students. And so a year later, they were able to figure it out and implement it. But that was an obvious update that needed to happen in the beginning that took a year to update. And to me, that says there's not enough resources and people working on issues like this.
But there needs to be an incentive to make it a priority also. So for example, there's something called SIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act, that all schools are SIPA compliant, which allows them to receive certain federal funding, which means that the school network has to have filters on it that prevent explicit content from being viewed at the school. My opinion is that that's not sufficient anymore. If we are giving children school-issued devices that now extend to the home, unless those school-issued devices, which are the responsibility, in my opinion, of the school to ensure are safe even when they're at home, SIPA compliance needs to extend to the school. And if the school hasn't ensured that that device, while at home, off of the school network, also complies with not allowing a child to get their hands on explicit content, then their federal funding should be at risk.
Right.
Just because the kid isn't attached to the school network anymore doesn't mean the school's responsibility to protect that child has gone away. That's a 25-year-old law that hasn't caught up to the fact that we now let the kid take the network home.
Right. Well, and in order to use the iPad, which is required, I signed away liability. Or I take liability now in my signature for anything that happens with that iPad at home. School's not liable. But
yet
there
you're
was
required to use it.
Yeah, I know. I thought, can I just not sign? If I don't sign this, then they can't use the iPad at all. Is that just a tricky way to opt out without them agreeing to it? I don't know. Cause it doesn't feel, it's not safe enough. It's not being locked down well enough at school, definitely not at home. And they offer additional protections for parents at home for those devices, but that doesn't kick in until 6 o'clock because there's after school programs that still need access during those times. Well, what kid is constantly monitored from 2:30 when they get out of school till 6 o'clock when parents are working? Not many. Pausing here to talk about tools that can help you manage your children's screen time and access to harmful content online. That is the Bark Phone and the Bark app. Bark goes beyond screen time monitoring using advanced AI to scan texts, social media, images, videos, and audio for threats like drug content, cyberbullying, even child sexual abuse material. The effects of your children's tech can be worrisome, but tools like Bark can give you peace of mind. The Bark phone is the world's most customizable kids phone with text and social media monitoring built in. It's the safest option. But if you are going with an Android or an iPhone, please consider layering on the Bark app, which is high-tech parental monitoring, scans their activities for the harmful content that they will get a hold of at some point, allows you to create screen time schedules, block certain websites and apps, and a ton more. Back to my conversation with Chris McKenna. So, okay, before we talk about some solutions and some ideas, your team sent out an email today, and you touched on the headline here you shared was LA public schools ran to AI and it failed. You said the school system tried an AI-assisted learning platform, but failed to ask some important questions. And I want to ask you about this, but first I want to describe that a lot of schools, especially mine, my district, is very excited about AI, very excited about ChatGPT. We had a digital safety night. They spent half the time showing us how ChatGPT works, typing things into it, showing us how cool it was, and telling us that teachers are going to start using it for their lesson plans and to assist in creativity for students. And I was like, whoa, red flag. Like, what are you talking about? So tell me more about what you guys shared here and what parents should know about this, about AI.
Sure. So just to explain the specific story. So it was just earlier this week. I know people will be watching or listening to this at different times, but it was within days of this conversation. Yeah. It came to light that there was an AI learning program that was intended to specifically target deficiencies in reading and other areas that then could be uniquely reflected back to help kids improve, right? It's a noble idea. And in fact, I've seen some AI technologies that have that capability, right? Where they can be listening to a child who is saying certain things a certain way phonetically and can reflect back uniquely. But the problem was with this particular program is that it was violating privacy and it was sharing all kinds of information and ultimately unhelpful information back to the students. So the title of the article was What All Parents Can Learn from the Troubled AI in Los Angeles Schools. But I think the subtitle is really the crux of it. And it says, an educational expert says schools fail to ask essential questions about AI for our children. I touched on these earlier. Number one, does it work? And number two, is it better than other alternatives? And those are the two questions that are being asked. Right. So on one hand, teachers using ChatGPT in order to speed up the creation of lesson plans. Awesome. I mean, what content creator right now hasn't used ChatGPT to come up with something that they used to spend hours outlining that now happens like that, right? Great. But I want a teacher to step back when it comes to then applying that to the kids. Again, it's got to get back to educational outcomes. Is it a transformative experience for the child that's better than what they're getting analog or some other way right now? If not, why do it? Is it supporting the child in some way that they couldn't otherwise get that information from something analog or something else they're already doing? Then why do it? Right? So we have to step back. And there's an organization that has a framework that every person in education who listens to this can use. It's free and available. It's called the EdTech Triangle that walks educators through this decision-making process. Is something transformative, supportive, this is kind of going down from better to worse, restrictive, or disruptive. And you place all of your uses of technology in the classroom in these four categories, which they've described. And then ask yourself, is it the right use of technology if it's in that restrictive or disruptive category versus being supportive or transformative with things that can only be done like computational thinking or computer animation or website design, right? You can only do that stuff in a digital environment. Or in the case of my son who has special needs, I have a son with Down syndrome who learned how to form sentences from an iPad that helped him form words with pictures. So I'm a father who appreciates some unique, what in that case were transformative uses of technology to help a child who is struggling reading. But it's because we all stepped back. We sat down with the teachers. We weighed different possibilities. We had tried other things that weren't working, and that was determined to be something we could try. It had the outcomes we were looking for, so we stuck with it, right? It was a process we went through to determine if that technology was going to be beneficial for Grant or not. And that's the kind of analysis that I just don't think is happening often enough. It's certainly not happening with AI. We need to put on the brakes with something that we truly do not understand what we have created. Like there are some that do, but those that are sort of everyday folks like you and I, who aren't the ones that are building these digital brains, we really have zero appreciation for the power of what is out there, right? Because you have things that are, I don't want to say, I mean, it's not harmless what happened in Los Angeles, but that's just kind of one kind of harmful version of AI. Because just like 3 hours ago, I get another article from the Wall Street Journal talking about the sprawling AI fake nude crisis that's now happening in South Korea through Telegram, coincidentally, which we know is in the news right now. But you've got teachers, military officers, undergraduates, and elementary school students who are having all kinds of fake pornographic images created of them shared in end-to-end encrypted environments because of AI that can scale this harm. Before we put that kind of thing that can be so easily weaponized in our educational system, let's make sure there's boundaries around it that are impenetrable for some of this stuff, and have asked those two basic questions that LA didn't ask.
Yeah, love that. It's asking the right questions. And no, the default doesn't always have to be technology as a baseline when it comes to education. And you have to ask the questions, how does it supplement, or how does it enhance what we're trying to do? Is it needed? Is it the benefits of it outweigh the harms? All these questions that are really important. And hopefully schools will begin asking. And can we move to solutions being, what would you recommend to schools? What would you recommend schools start thinking about related to the use of the school issued devices in school? And I have some suggestions as well.
Sure. Yeah. I think there are some learn to read apps that, if evaluated and if tested with some students in your specific school, they can be used. They're especially well suited to, say, phonemic or awareness or phonics, all those kinds of things that can help a student learn. My son, right, being the beneficiary of some of that, digital spaces that eliminate some of the usual distraction that you and I talked about earlier. Let's look for some of those attributes. I also do want teachers to consider classifying their educational technology into one of 4 usefulness categories that the EdTech triangle lays out: transformative, supportive, restrictive, or disruptive. And along with that, set meaningful, informed screen time limitations by grade. That there's like a daily max that you don't ever want to surpass, even in your use of transformative technology in the classroom, knowing that, I mean, we are physical creatures. And to go purely scientific for just a minute, purely secular for just a minute, in our evolutionary arc as a species here, we have only been using technology for like a speck. And we've only been like reading instead of just talking for kind of like a big dot. The rest of our existence is just physical in the world. We learn best and exist best and relate to each other best physically, because as a brain and as a human species, that's what most of us knows how to do best. It stands to reason that we learn best in that way too, just because of, you know, who we are. So those are some things I would want us to evaluate. Privacy in everything that we're doing with students. So these are some of the things that we look for, Nikki. We have 6 criteria that we use to evaluate whether a school can become a tech-ready school, 6 different best practice attributes. We're certifying schools with this little mini certification for schools that are doing things around education, around ed tech, around the network they have, around educating their students and their parents and their staff, around being in a way for the day kind of school. These are the things that we look for schools that want to differentiate themselves in these areas of technology from others. So the parents, not only current parents, but prospective parents who are weighing differences in schools can go, wow, that's one that gets it. They've done these things. We want that to mean something. So those are some ideas, because we don't just want to talk about the problems, why we created that certification as an assessment. There's this big assessment schools go through that will help them solve sort of a red light, green light, yellow light kind of assessment, and then work towards solutions so they can be a tech ready school, which we think means something. So
do you have a list of the schools that are tech ready available to parents?
I don't, because it's about 6 months old. We're working through our first batch of pilot schools right now. We're going to be working on that. And as soon as I don't even have a space on my website for it yet, Nikki. This is what I've piloted with. There are about 8 different schools that are going through it right now to help me work out sort of the what things I didn't think of. And I'm really, really happy with it. And you'll start to hopefully see that, say, in footers of schools to say, hey, we're tech ready, and that's going to mean something. So
that's incredible and so valuable to parents. And I think becoming more and more important in our choices in finding schools that are proactive around technology. You don't have to have the strictest rules and use no tech at all, but that they're thinking proactively about the mental health and the physical health of our children and how technology affects that. And for me, and I'm kind of working on my own suggestions for parents to bring up with their schools and in district meetings and things like that for schools and for legislation. But the biggest things for me is devices later, at the right times, in the right subjects. I don't think we need them in every single subject and every single grade. I love the idea of computer cart versus one-to-one. I think giving kids ownership over their own device gives them too much time to figure out how to get around any controls and is not necessary because they shouldn't need it at all times, right? So using it when needed out of a cart that travels around the school, or there's a few classrooms that share a cart, you have it when needed, but you put it back. That would give parents a lot more empowerment in what our kids are getting access to on the devices.
Definitely. No, those are great. Those are great questions.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to provide. So I have a post that's written that's called the 5 questions you need to ask every principal about IT in your school.
Great.
And that's the kind of thing that I think you're trying to, equip, those that are listening or watching this, because we know not everybody feels confident in those conversations, right?
Right.
Not only is it in a space we don't know, but now I'm approaching leadership in something I don't know. So we want to give parents the right questions to ask and not be satisfied until you get the answers.
And what do you do when you get the answer? So to loop back to, and then we'll close out, but to loop back to my question for the district about what data is being collected on my children, I have a list now. What do I do with it? Do I say, I don't want that to be shared? Am I allowed to do that? So just the empowerment of understanding what you're asking and why you're asking it, and then having the confidence to say no, I think is important too, or ask for options. Do we have any power here? Or is it to go to the school, we have to just opt in for whatever they're doing there?
So there's a vertical hierarchy here that I think is worthwhile. I don't want even educators who are listening to this, I'm not trying to create just a whole band of parental vigilantes. I mean, no. Heavens knows we don't need more parents causing trouble, at schools. I get that. It's a hard time to be a teacher. It's a hard time to be a principal. I understand those things. But if you feel as though, in the case, I think you have a great example there, Nikki, with that information. If you're not satisfied, if there's something still unsettled in your mama gut on how that data about your kiddos is being handled, then I would want whoever you got that from to hear that. And then if you don't get the outcome, then you go to the next person, you go to the principal. Then if you don't get that outcome, you go to the superintendent, and you don't hide the fact that I'm going to see you at the next school board meeting, and I'm going to share this information. And then from there, we're going to continue the process. News loves these kinds of things. And again, I'm not trying to create a lot of drama for the school, but you have a say as a parent. And if you're not getting the answers that are satisfactory, then there are outlets. Parents do have a lot of power. This is where the virality of things being shared on social media can be used for good, as you and I are trying to do through our platforms, to tell as many parents as possible through social media, right? So don't be satisfied, and know that you do have the ability, and just keep moving up the chain. And until you're happy. Sometimes there are solutions that are even alternatives that you're the first one that's asking. And so they have to come up with an alternative, and sometimes they will, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Chances are you'll empower other parents. It's sort of like, the Berlin Wall, I think is one of the most perfect examples. I think anybody, like imagine an alien coming down and seeing that the first time and going, why don't people just knock the dumb thing down? But we had this sort of mindset, it was almost like you were in a cage and didn't know you were in a cage. And like, as soon as one person started to knock that thing down, it was like scales fell and everybody was like, well, yeah, knock the thing down. And it all fell down. And like, it's hard to even imagine that was something that separated two parts of a city just visually for so long that really had no power. And sometimes I think we just need to remember that you might be the one that starts the tumble just by asking one question.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to ask it.
Agree. And don't be afraid to just share your opinions with other parents. I know it can be hard, and then also with your teachers, see how they feel about it. Because oftentimes teachers are in the same boat and they're struggling with the same things that you're noticing. And so bringing people together and then coming as a united front with a concern, I think is important. And we covered a lot today. I want to share a quote that I like related to this by a professor at Furman University named Paul Thomas. And he says that teaching is a human experience. And I think that that's what we all need to be reflecting on. Like you said, the length of time that we have been learning and our brains have developed to learn from face-to-face interactions is still where we're at. We can't replace human beings with technology when it comes to education. And we have to be asking the important questions on what's best for our kids in this space. And so, Chris, tell listeners where they can connect with you and your team, and if you have anything big coming up besides your list of tech-ready schools, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, I hope I can start talking about that soon.
Yeah.
So visit us at Protect Young Eyes. We enjoy these kinds of conversations. So when I'm not presenting, I love consulting. I love coming alongside a school that is ready for some change. I'm walking alongside a school that's trying to become phone free. And how do you market that to their families? And what are the policies that are needed for that, right? Those are some things that if you're saying as a school leader, I don't have room and I don't have time, and you're right. And I want to come alongside and bring expertise to that process. I love that. I'm a consulting business solutions kind of guy. That was the profession I left before I was called into ministry and now internet safety. That's what I did, is I helped businesses solve problems and get from current state to future state. So if you're a teacher like a principal or school leader in that space, know that if that future state seems overwhelming, we can help you get there. For parents, we have some scripts and ideas how to have these conversations. Just go to phonefreeschools.com and they'll redirect you to a post that has all kinds of information on what script you might want to use when it comes to some of these issues and policies and ideas. And again, just don't, like you, I love that you're not satisfied with wait, this is what you're sharing. We want you to know what to do next. And there are other organizations that we, partner with, like the Phone Free School Movement. There are so many that are rowing in this direction that just know that there is somebody who can help you. But just start on the website, drop us a note into the form there, and Michelle, my assistant, and I will figure out how to help you.
Amazing, Chris. Thank you so much for your time. I hope everybody goes to protectyoungeyes.com and learns more about the work there. And we will be in touch soon because things are changing in this space and lots of new stuff coming out. So we'll be in touch, and thank you, Chris.
I hope so. Thank you, Nikki. Bye-bye.
Thank you.